Tokyo, late morning. The air is cool and raw for spring. The light a polished tin. A clerk looks up from his counter as the glass in the shop front begins to tremble first. A tremor, then a chatter. The sound is wrong. Not the thin, needling rasp of a single-engine trainer, not the flat drone of a mail plane. This has weight. This has bones. Two engines, beating out a syncopated thrum that leans against the city like a shoulder. On the roof of an office building, a young air defense spotter lifts binoculars. He expects to see gulls or high contrails from army bombers passing over. Instead, a dark, boxy fuselage clips across the rooftops, low, too low, the wings thick and blunt like the arms of a heavyweight. The tail flashes past and he catches a stenciled star before the airplane slants away, disappearing behind a silk factory and a haze of chimney smoke. He knows the sound now. American. Twin engine. Not a fighter. Not a float plane. Something that shouldn't be here. He yanks the field telephone off its hook and barks the report he's been drilled to give: bearing, altitude, count. The words feel unreal in his mouth. The aircraft he describes do not fit any card in the recognition pack they keep in the drawer downstairs. Those cards assume a world with rules. American carriers fling small, single-engine aircraft. Land-based bombers heavier, broader, winged stay, chained to their long concrete runways. These are those. He knows it. A woman at a tram stop hears the engine note tilt. She turns her head instinctively, the way city people do when the air itself grows curious. The bomber slides across the boulevard, so low the pilot can see clotheslines and the red lattice of a radio tower. It is not a ghost. It throws a long shadow that folds over a policeman and a rice merchant and two children who stare and point, their mouths making small O's, their minds not yet catching up to the physics of the scene. The policeman is the first to react. He shouts and waves, as if a hand signal can push an airplane out of the sky. Sirens start. Late, thin, sporadic. The nearest flak battery swings toward the sound, but the bomber is already somewhere else, lofted, leveled, then dipping a wing to set up a run. The pilot holds a line along a canal. The bombardier, sprawled over a simple sight that looks nothing like the complex gear Japan's intelligence officers expect, calls distance and drift. A cluster of small bombs clatters free and steps down the air like punctuation. In the next ward, a second aircraft clears a rooftop and knifes along a broad avenue. Its radials cough and then catch in a steady thunder that turns sentences to fragments in every room it passes. Dinner bowls tremble, ink bottles shiver, teeth rattle in drawers. There is the flat slap of detonations, sharp, brilliant, more noise and fire than mass. Smoke rises, black and thin in the wind. In the Imperial General Headquarters, a staff officer hears the first reports and feels the temperature in the room change by a fraction. He was taught the architecture of the homeland's safety, picket boats in a ring, aircraft warning lines, fighter regiments at the ready, the vast moat of the ocean itself. All of that feels suddenly like a diagram on bad paper. Squint, and you can already see the tear. He asks for confirmation. The runner who brings it is flushed and wide-eyed. The message is simple. Multiple enemy twin-engine planes over the capital. The officer repeats the words, as if meaning will solidify in transit. Twin engine. Over Tokyo. The line officers around him do not laugh. He senses in their stillness the most dangerous thing a military culture can feel. Unfamiliarity. Back in the streets, people do the math in their guts. If American planes can be here low, thunderous, visible, then there is no buffer. The buffer was supposed to be a chain of facts. Carrier aviation equals small airframes. Medium bombers need long runways. The Pacific is wide. Our pickets are watchful. Our fighters intercept. Each of those facts was a bead on a rosary that, when counted, became a kind of comfort. Now the beads are scattered, and comfort is an empty string. The damage is real but limited. Burned warehouses, shattered windows, punctured roofs, wreckage that can be photographed and tallied. The shock is the greater weapon. It travels faster than shrapnel and lands everywhere at once in households, in ward offices, in the editorial rooms of newspapers that must decide how to describe a thing their readers do not believe can happen. Soldiers on leave stare skyward with the same disbelief as civilians. A small boy, one of the two who pointed Niels on the tram, stops bench and tells his sister that he could see the pilot. He makes a face to show a jaw set hard. He will remember that face for the rest of his life. The first interception attempt is hesitant, late, and poorly vectored. In the confusion, the recognition problem multiplies. There are reports of enemy seaplanes, of Army type this and type that don't exist, of American Hudsons and American Mosquitoes, names pulled from rumor and magazines. The truth is stranger and simpler. Medium bombers, North American B-25 Mitchells, have crossed the moat. They have arrived from nowhere, which is to say, from the sea. That is how the mind experiences it. A conjuring. A single bomber streaks over a government compound, and the guards duck with their rifles still slung. A colonel steps outside, the brim of his cap catching dust and sunlight. He tastes bitterness at the back of his throat. He does not reckon the physics. He feels the insult. He is a professional. He hates surprises. He had signed off on war as a contest of known quantities. Divisions, hulls, tons, miles. This thing that just clawed the sky open above him is not in his ledger. There are legends about shock, how it moves through societies faster than information. People are made of stories. They tell themselves about what is possible. The raid, even in its first uncompromising minutes, begins to rewrite those stories. When the sirens finally find their full throat and the city's defensive system spins up to speed, the bombers are already angling away, stretching their legs toward a coast they will not reach. But at street level, no one knows that yet. They know only what they saw: boxy American aircraft, low enough to see rivets, and the stinging smell of explosive in alleys that yesterday smelled only of soy and steam. An office boy in a khaki apron chases the echo down the length of a corridor and skids to a stop in front of his supervisor. "Sir," he says, panting, "foreign planes." The supervisor nods as if that solves anything. The boy's eyes are right. The words are right. The world they describe is new. "How did those bombers get here?" the city asks, collectively, wordlessly. Past the picket boats, past the arc of fighter squadrons, past the sense that the sea itself would unmake such an attempt. The answer, still miles away on two pitching flight decks beneath a grey Pacific sky, is as audacious as the sight that prompted the question. Before April, the defence of the Japanese home islands rested not only on ships and guns but on an elegant proof. The sort of tidy logic staff colleges teach because it feels like engineering. It starts with runway length. A medium bomber like the B-25 Mitchell, loaded with crew, fuel and bombs, wants a long, forgiving strip hundreds of meters of honest, unmoving ground. Even aggressive short-field techniques still assume earth that does not heave and bow through a swell. Americans have carriers, yes, but carriers launch fighters and dive bombers, compact airframes built to catapult off a wave-cut rectangle of deck. That rectangle imposes a discipline on physics that medium bombers refuse. Therefore, Q, E, D. No threat of land-based bombers raiding the home islands from the sea. Bolt on two more. Therefores, and the proof becomes airtight. Therefore, any American medium bomber must come from land Alaska, the Philippines, China, places far away, easily watched, easily guessed. Therefore, if you ring the home islands with picket craft in skirmish lines and station early warning posts along likely vectors, you will never be surprised by heavier aircraft. You will hear they are coming long before they arrive, because the sea rules what is possible. The proof explains more than geometry. It comforts doctrine. Japanese carriers themselves are designed around the rhythm of small aircraft operations. Fighters to cleanse the air, dive bombers and torpedo planes to break hulls. The defenses at home mirror that rhythm. Fighter regiments are arranged to climb into known patterns of intercept against known kinds of threats. A medium bomber profile, fat-bodied, long-legged, doesn't fit the mental slot labeled carrier threat. Even recognition training enforces the cultural confidence. Flashcards of enemy carrier planes are all single-engine types. Slide them in a fan across a table, and you can feel the consensus. This is the world. But proofs smuggle in assumptions. The first is that airplanes will always be flown the way they were designed. The second is that carrier decks behave like runways, just enough to be compared to runways, a quiet category error baked into thousands of briefings. The third is more subtle. It assumes that the enemy wants damage first. If you believe that, then you judge threats by the size of bomb loads, power settings, and how much weight a deck can bear. But there is another kind of target. Belief. Let's break the impossible into the parts that made it feel solid. Deck length versus takeoff run. A carrier's usable deck space for launching a large airplane isn't the entire ship. Parked aircraft, safety margins, and the stubby, uncompromising bow carve the rectangle down. On the American side, the launch problem was a math problem with only ugly numbers. A Mitchell's normal takeoff roll with fuel and ordnance could run to 4 figures in feet. You do not persuade a staff officer with poetry about courage. You persuade him with lift coefficients and wind over deck. The Japanese analysis never imagined Americans would go hunting for every foot of free performance, half flaps, set just so, propellers biting air that's already moving across the deck, because the carrier herself is sprinting 20+ knots into a headwind that adds another 15-20 knots to the equation. The deck may be 400 and 5,500 feet of usable space. The runway the airplane sees, in aerodynamic terms, becomes longer because the air itself is moving at the airplane before the wheels roll. Weight and balance. Heavy aircraft invite a simple verdict: too much mass, too little deck. But mass isn't a single brick. It's a collection of suitcases you can unpack. America's raiders stripped weight out of turrets, swapped precision devices for cheap sights, and traded armor for fuel range. None of that looks dramatic on a line drawing. It is decisive at the point where rubber meets plank, wingspan and deck safety. On paper, the idea of a medium bomber on a carrier deck triggers visions of snares and collisions. Wings wider than safe taxi lanes, propeller arcs too close to catwalk rails, a drunkard's chance of nicking a parked fighter. Japanese doctrine, shaped by years of honorable caution around flight deck risks, didn't compute the problem as soluble. The assumption is that the enemy shares your tolerance for hazard. He does not. Picket lines and probability. The ocean screen, the picket boat chain thrown like a net ahead of the homeland wasn't just a tactical barrier, it was a confidence machine. If something bulky and dangerous is approaching, you will hear it pluck the strings of the net. You can plot the tangle. The net does not account for an enemy who treats detection not as a stop sign but as a starter pistol. If the US task force is spotted early, the Japanese model assumes the raid aborts. That assumption is a strategic belief disguised as a reconnaissance concept. Fighter coverage and range. Home defense squadrons and fleet air arms expected to burn down anything that arrived low and slow. But the silhouettes on the recognition cards make you complacent. A twin-engine medium bomber doesn't just fly differently. It looks like a puzzle during those first seconds of visual acquisition. If your brain calls it impossible, your hands delay. Psychological armor. The firmest layer of the impossible wasn't written in manuals. It lived quietly in the posture of watch officers and the invisible routines of clerks who stamped documents that said the ocean did this and aircraft did that. Cultures build these rules to simplify chaos. They hold until someone refuses to honor them. The assumption held shape because on a blackboard it represents ordinary prudence. Why risk a heavy, expensive aircraft and a carrier deck on a stunt? Why threaten crews with fuel margins so thin you can read through them? Why ask pilots to nail a launch profile that leaves no steps between success and catastrophe? In peacetime, those are correct questions. In war, they miss the point. The value of the raid is not the weight of steel it drops. It is the weight it lifts off the backs of allied citizens who need proof their enemy can be reached, and the weight it places on the enemy's chest when he wakes to the sound of aircraft he has been promised he will never hear. The Japanese staff would have told you their model was conservative. In truth, It was brittle. Brittle models shatter on contact with an opponent who uses your axioms as levers, not laws. The Americans did not break the rules of physics. They rearranged the givens. Deck run plus ship speed plus headwind equals a new airspeed at brake release. Gross weight minus armor plus auxiliary tanks equals a new range. Disciplined short field technique plus pilot nerve equals a new takeoff distance. Abort on detection becomes launch on detection. None of this lives naturally in risk-averse doctrine. All of it fits comfortably inside a culture that has decided the shock itself is the payload. There were, of course, Japanese officers who, if asked to imagine such an attempt, could have sketched the vulnerabilities. If heavy aircraft can use decks at all, they will be limited in number. The launch will be slow. The fuel state will be grim. The crews will not be coming home to carriers. It sounds like a suicide budget, a one-time tactic that strains credulity as a repeatable method, which is precisely why it worked once, brilliantly. An enemy who thinks in series expects your first act to be the first of many. He papers over the possibility that this first act was designed to exist alone, to land not on a runway but in his imagination with a thud. Remember the boy at the tram stop, the officer in the courtyard, the clerk under the trembling glass. Their shock is not a flaw in their character. It is the audible snap of a cultural assumption breaking. From the staff room to the street, the logic had been simple enough to be beautiful. Carriers equal light aircraft, medium bombers equal ground. That proof had bound the nation's sense of where danger could come from. When the B-25 seconds shadows slid over tiles and tram lines, Japan discovered what it means to be defended by an equation. In the next chapters, we'll pull back the curtain on the American side of the ledger, how a submarine officer with a good eye, a carrier task force with a taste for risk, and a set of pilots drilled to find lift in places pilots don't look, turned physically impossible into barely possible, which is often all that history requires. But for now, hold the moment. The sky over Tokyo, split by the sound of engines that all the careful arithmetic said you would never hear. Norfolk, Virginia. Winter light, flat and metallic, lies over the piers like sheet steel. Captain Francis S., low submariner by trade, planner by temperament, rides in the right seat of an SNJ trainer and squints down at a naval air station runway. From up here, the land looks like a board game. Then he sees it, a rectangular paint job on concrete, narrow, with a bold centerline and hash marks, as if someone had sketched a ship on the earth. Carriers practice here, fighters land here. The detail snaps into focus. A deck without the ocean. And there, moving dots, submarines trolling just offshore, conning towers knifing the chop. The idea writes itself in the space between two heartbeats. If you can put a deck on land to teach pilots to hit it, could you put land bombers on a deck to launch them? Not to recover, no, to launch. You're not building a new way of flying. You're building a one-time bridge. Back in Washington, Lowe brings the spark to Admiral Ernest J. King, the newly ascendant chief of naval operations, whose eyes are famously colder than the rooms he works in. King listens without carving his impatience across the air the way he sometimes does. He is thinking in longer lines, political shock, morale, the sudden need to show a nervous nation that the Pacific is not a locked room. Go on, he says, and Lowe does. Twin-engine medium bombers for range, flown off a fleet carrier, striking industrial targets on the Japanese home islands, then continuing west to China. No recovery, no return to sender. Once they go, they are spent arrows. The sticking point is not imagination, it is weight. A carrier is a finite rectangle with physics welded to the bow. What airplane can accept that insult and climb anyway? The Navy shuffles candidate types. The Glenn Martin B-26, marauder sleek but a diva about takeoff run. The Douglas A-20 Havoc solid, but range, starved for this mission. The North American B-25 Mitchell workmanlike, forgiving, with a wing that carries like a patient mule. The B-25 has the right mix of manners and muscle. It can lift on short notice if lightened and coaxed. It does not punish imperfect technique the way a B-26 might. The choice is not about glamour. It is about margin. Someone must own the craziness publicly. The name that comes back is James H. Doolittle aviator, engineer, stuntman tempered into officer. He brings the kind of credibility you can spend at a briefing table. He listens to the problem deck. Run, fuel, weight, accuracy, egress, and smiles the way men do when they discover a constraint they can romance rather than fight. Doolittle doesn't ask if it's doable. He asks what has to be true for it to become doable. Pieces start to move at American speed. The Army will provide the air crews and machines. The Navy will provide the decks and the headwind. China will provide the landing grounds, such as they are. Inter-service friction flickers and then subsides, dulled by the shared hunger for an answer to Pearl Harbor that is more than a headline. At North American and at depots in Kansas City and Sacramento, men with wrenches and clipboards begin to carve fat from Mitchells and pour capacity back in as fuel. The modifications will turn in weeks, not months, because weeks is the entire budget. Doolittle handpicks crews the way a card sharp builds a hand pilot's, with hands as steady as plumb lines and nerves like wire. Bombardiers who can release by feel. Engineers who can read a fuel line as if it were a sentence. There are quiet conversations, and then a new vocabulary blooms at Eglin Field in Florida, where the Navy and the Army will teach each other something neither believes the other knows. The liaison officer is a Navy lieutenant named Henry Miller, and he brings more than technique to the party. He brings a culture of deck risk, the idea that inches are generous and enough is in fact enough. In Tokyo, none of this is visible. What a Japanese officer could see, if he could watch the American staff work, is the erasure of categories. The line between fighter operations and medium bomber operations is being rubbed thinner with each phone call. The calendar becomes a drum. Across two services that normally guard their turf like dogs, a single rhythm emerges. Make weight fall, make range grow, make procedures simple enough to do once, correctly, while a ship heaves under your wheels. Every meeting has an undertow. This is theatre as much as tactics. You are mounting a show, and the audience is both the enemy's general staff and the butcher's boy on the tram platform who needs to see the sky as fragile again. King fights for the hulls to be risked, and wins. The carrier USS Hornet will sail with her deck stacked not with sleek Navy birds but with Army Mitchells. The carrier USS Enterprise will be the escort, and the sword and shield both. Admiral William F. Halsey will lead the task force through the needle's eye between detection and consequence, and will sign the most dangerous sentence in his career. Launch the Army bombers. Lowe's spark has jumped every gap bureaucratic, doctrinal, logistical, and landed on a deck on the far side of the country where an airplane that belongs to the earth is about to learn, briefly, to belong to the sea. The plan is not elegant in the traditional sense. It is a kludge of faith, math, and nerve. That is what war rewards beautiful solutions to ugly constraints. In a few weeks, when Japanese clerks write out the day's incident reports in careful characters, some of them will realize that the first stroke of ink was drawn here, over a painted deck on a Norfolk runway, when a submariner looked down and imagined the ocean as a runway no one else could see. You begin by lying to the airplane about its own weight. Armor plates? Out. Lower turret on some ships? Removed or locked, depending on the airframe. Ammunition that won't be fired? Left on the SACE shelf. Precision bomb sight that is delicate, heavy, and surplus to a low-level dash through urban canyons, replaced with a simple sight you can make on a bench with tubing and screws, a device more honest than it looks. The rule is pitiless. If the item will not contribute to launch, navigation, or survival to China, it is dead weight. Then you tell the airplane the sweetest lie of all. You are bigger on the inside. Fuel is range, and range is the artery that runs from the idea to the target. Standard tanks are full. Auxiliary tanks, rubber bladders in the bomb bay, and in the crawl spaces that make crew chiefs wince are plumbed and tested. Each gallon is a sentence added to the story. Power on, climb, cruise, bomb run, turn, long, hungry leg into the west. Crews memorize numbers the way actors memorize lines. At such and such manifold pressure you burn so many gallons per hour. At such and such RPM you can stretch until the gauges talk to you in fumes. Fuel discipline becomes a religion without hymns. Weight and balance sheets multiply. Takeoff gross is pushed right up against a line no one can see from the cockpit. In the hangar, a crewman will stand under a wing and lay a palm against the skin, as if feeling the airplane's temperature. He imagines lift as something tangible, a fluid you can scoop with a spoon. Engineers hand around pieces of paper that say the same thing in different fonts. This will be tight, and tight is fine if tight is honest. Weapons are not allowed to bully the plan. Bomb loads are chosen with an eye for theatre, as much as destruction incendiaries and 500-pound general-purpose bombs that will make smoke visible from a dozen wards and slap home in photographs. Tail guns become theatre too. Some crews fit broomsticks in the rear windows to make an intercepting fighter think twice. The mission is all deceptions on paper, on radar, in the mind of a pilot who looks over a shoulder and sees a silhouette he knows, or thinks he knows. A B-25's cockpit is a practical room. You sit there and it tells you truths: airspeed, altitude, oil pressure, cylinder head temperature, the way the yoke feels when the wing is carrying more than it wants. One truth it will not tell you is whether a carrier deck is a runway. You have to supply that belief yourself. So the modifications are built to load that belief with help. A precise elevator trim mark that gives you a nose, upbite right at liftoff, flap settings chalked into muscle memory, mixture and prop levers rigged to hit target settings in one smooth handful. Crew checklists are rewritten to be shorter than fear. It is not just the airplane that gets modified. The crew compartments do too in their heads. The navigator rehearses a route he cannot afford to lose. The radio operator tunes the ether for beacons he may never hear. The bombardier practices releasing by feel rather than by sacred instrument. The pilot teaches his feet to hold brakes until the whole machine quivers, then to ease off as if convincing a nervous horse to leave a barn on a cold morning. The co-pilot becomes a metronome, calling airspeed as if he were the only one who could see it. Night work in the hangars is a chorus of small sounds. Safety wire twisting tight, fuel lines burping trapped air, a wrench's flat clink. In the daylight, the crews run numbers on the backs of envelopes. Distance to target, distance to China. Margin if a headwind shows up when it shouldn't. If everything goes right, this is barely possible. If one big thing goes wrong, you write your letters and leave them unsealed. On the Japanese side of the ocean, assumptions sit quietly in filing cabinets. A medium bomber? On a carrier? No. But the American mechanics in Florida are not working to refute a premise in a seminar. They are preparing to ask a wing to do a trick once, and then never again. They are calibrating hinge friction on a bet. They are filing a bracket because every ounce you grind from, cellulose and aluminum, is an ounce you can reappear as gasoline. They are turning craftsmanship into strategy. By the time the modified B-25 seconds roll toward the coast rails of Hornet, you can see the work in their posture. The airplanes squat a little, heavy in a different way. They carry the sheen of machines that have been handled a lot, panels on and off, safety latches popped and closed, pencil marks and fingerprints wiped, and then replaced. They look like what they are. A story about to be told in a grammar the enemy will not recognize, in a tense they do not expect. The bombers will not land where they take off. Their maps have edges. What matters, finally, is that every technical compromise points in the same direction toward the first 30 seconds of takeoff. Get flying, and you have options. Fail there, and the sea takes you in a way that leaves no footnote. That's why every fastener you can't see in a black and white photograph carries more weight than the bomb load it suspends. Because lift is a collective act. Designers gave the Mitchell a decent wing. Depot hands gave it diet and new veins. Crews gave it procedures and faith. Taken together, those gifts make a medium bomber, a conditional carrier aircraft. Conditional is enough. Eglin Field, Florida, is where suspicion becomes muscle memory. The Navy sends Lieutenant Henry L. Miller to teach Army pilots how to fly as if the ground is moving beneath them. He is compact, all edges and economy, the kind of instructor who spends verbs carefully. He draws a rectangle on the runway with lime and says, "That's your ship." The first time a B-25 noses up to it, the pilot can feel his own skepticism climb into his lap. Miller does not teach romance. He teaches procedures that shave risk in slices you can measure with a thumbnail. Set flaps half, not full. Too much, and drag eats the margin you pretend to have. Trim nose up to a pencil mark he makes on the wheel column. Feet hard on the brakes. Bring power up smoothly to a number the engines tolerate without complaint. RPM, manifold pressure. He drills the exact figures until they sit in the back of your eyes. Watch cylinder head temperatures. These radials will lie to you about heat until it is too late. When the tail wants to fly, let it. When the nose wants to lift, listen but do not believe until the airspeed indicator agrees. If the bow of your imaginary ship is in a trough, don't wait for a crest, trust the wind you have, not the wave you want. Release brakes with calculation, not hope. The first runs are ugly. Brakes smoke. Props bark, airspeed calls come too fast or too late. 80, 90, 95, and pilots snatch at lift as if catching a falling glass. Miller shakes his head the way carpenters do when a student uses a chisel like a screwdriver. He climbs up on the nacelle, leans into the cockpit window, and speaks in nouns. Trim here, hand there, eyes here. He makes the artificial deck smaller. He shortens the safety margin. He makes it real. Doolittle moves among the crews like current. He is a man pilots want to please without quite knowing why. He insists on competence over swagger. He will not punish a bulky landing gear or a misset trim tab with theatrics. He will fix it and run the drill again. You can feel a culture forming in the Florida heat, humble about physics, arrogant about effort. The magic number becomes the distance at which a B-25 can be coaxed into air with the load it will carry on a ship. The rectangle shrinks. The pilot's confidence grows, not like a balloon but like a reef layered, built piece by piece, sharp in places you cannot see from the surface. They practice with a headwind when they can get it and without when they cannot. Miller teaches them the gift a carrier gives that a runway will not. Wind over deck. He does the math with chalk on the skin of the airplane. If the ship runs at 20+ knots into a 15-knot wind, your wing gets a 40-knot, present before your wheels roll a foot. Don't waste it, he says, as if you could spend wind like money. Crew roles iterate into habit. Co-pilots become airspeed priests. 70, 80, 90. You have 95. Engineers watch needles like gamblers who know the house edge by heart. Bombardiers and navigators become ballast during the launch. Heads down, hands still. Every unnecessary motion is a theft of attention from the man on the yoke. Abort criteria are rehearsed and then made to vanish. Once the ship commits, there will be no stopping. The psychology flips. The riskiest moment is not the decision to go, it is the decision to delay. Then comes the day when the rectangle is not paint. The Hornet is a steel thing, wet, moving, temperamental. The first time a Mitchell noses up to the bow on a rolling sea, the pilot's breath shortens despite himself. The equations from Eglin feel like a story someone else told. Miller is there, a small figure with wind clawing at his clothes, giving the arm signals that now matter more than radios. Doolittle's crew watches the deck pitch through a rhythm, counts the beats, and matches breath to the ship's inhale. You would think the pilots who wanted this mission most would be the ones who talk loudest. They are not. The best at the short-deck launch are the ones who have learned to crush their own impulse to over-control. You do not lever the airplane into the sky. You slide it there, fusing deck motion, wind, and lift into a single, unbroken gesture. When it works, it looks like magic. Up close, it is checklist and discipline, refined under a Florida sun by a Navy lieutenant who did not care what patch a man wore if he could learn. Eglin also teaches something that won't fit in a notebook. The understanding that risk can be cubed by weather, by ship motion, by weight, and that your only answer is to flatten two of those three variables by art. You cannot make the sea behave. You cannot change the airplane's bone-deep wing loading. You can make your own inputs perfect. That is what the crews carry away, packed somewhere behind the sternum, where fear normally sits. By the time they leave Florida, the Mitchell crews know exactly what barely possible feels like in their hands. They know it in the twitch of a wheel, in the bite of a prop, in the pitch of an engine note as it comes up on song. They know what the first 10 seconds of the launch demand and what the next 20 reward. They have rehearsed the mission's only uncompromising minute until compromise itself is driven out. At sea, there will be spray and cold, and a horizon that tilts. At sea, there will be Miller's hand, and the flag, and the unblinking rectangle of deck that does not care how you feel about it. The pilots will make that deck enough. The Pacific is a quilt of weather, squares grey, blue, steel, slate stitched by wind. Task Force 16 hums across that fabric with the focus of a blade. Out front, destroyers cut scent trails in the water that gulls try to read. In the center is the heart. USS Hornet. Her deck, a parking lot of Army bombers lashed down with cables and optimism. USS Enterprise, the sword and shield. Her flight deck loaded with fighters and scouts to keep the wolves at arm's length. Admiral William F. Halsey carries the responsibility like a weight across his shoulders that makes him taller rather than smaller. The plan is simple enough to be fragile. Get close, stay unseen, launch on schedule, recede like a fist unclenching. Hidden in the sea lanes ahead is the Japanese early warning system picket boats strung in a ragged arc. Each is a set of ears and eyes, each a string tin canned into the warning net. The American staff has sketched the arc on maps, so often it has become a superstition. Slide between the threads, and you're a ghost. Touch one, and you're a target. Halsey drives hard under a sky that cannot decide what it wants to be. There are moments of bright clarity, where the task force looks like toys on a mirror. There are moments of low murk where the horizon feels 10 inches away and sound travels farther than sight. The launch plan assumes a certain geometry of surprise. Fly from X miles east of Japan, with Y hours of daylight to spare, and give the bombers Z gallons of grace to reach the far coast of China. Those letters were chosen carefully, their values argued over by men who sleep lightly and dream of numbers. They are about to become lies because the enemy will not cooperate by being absent. Before dawn, a contact, a picket boat where the map says there might be one. One of the American destroyers shoulders in like a bar fighter and opens up. The little ship dies loudly, with radio waves, which is to say it lives long enough to shout. The air itself feels different after that charged, thinner. Halsey doesn't need a committee to tell him what logic requires. Every minute the task force continues inbound is a minute the enemy can vector steel and wings to this patch of water. The whole point of this mission is shock, not etiquette. He signals Hornet. Launch the Army bombers. The order drops into the bowels of the ship and turns into footsteps, hand signals, chocks kicked away. On the flight deck, air becomes substance spray hurled sideways, exhaust a punching bag for the wind. The first Mitchell is towed into the teeth of the bow. You can see the numbers without hearing them. Ship speed into wind, deck angle, bow rise, the way the sea claws at the hull like a cat that wants to be let in. Crews strap in. Faces go smaller in the cockpit glass as men settle into themselves. This is earlier than planned and farther than they wanted. The graphs of fuel versus distance versus hope tilt the wrong way now. No one says the word abort, because that word is from a different mission, a different war. The language at hand is imperative. Go now. The enemy net has been plucked. The bell has been struck. The only way out is through. Halsey's staff watches the sky with two kinds of fear in their throats. The first is obvious. Can a heavy airplane launch clean in this sea state with this wind at this weight without going nose, down into grey and vanishing? The second is larger. If they do, will the Japanese read the alarm and lift fighters onto a sky the Mitchells must cross at low altitude, out of place and alone? The answer to both hangs on minutes, And on the paradox, the crew learned in Florida move slowly inside quick decisions. Destroyers scrape what's left of the picket boat chain, hurling steel as if puncturing a net by anger would keep it from catching fish. Enterprise keeps her own planes ready to swat at anything that comes sniffing. The radio nets go curt, then quiet. On Hornet, the deck crew looks like a machine that breathes smoke. One by one, the Mitchells make their prima nocta with the sea. A marriage neither partner wanted. Wheels roll, brakes bite and release. Engines claw air. There are moments when the bow drops and the gap between propeller tip and green water becomes a question with no words. There are moments when lift is a whisper, and then, because of wind and belief and the way air thickens around a wing at just the right angle, a shout. When each bomber staggers free, the deck lets out a breath you can feel in your teeth. The picket line has done its job. Japan now knows something is out here. But think about the human chain that turns something into understanding. An operator copies a garbled message. A petty officer decides whether to wake a lieutenant. A lieutenant weighs embarrassment against alarm. A staff officer asks a question no one can answer. What kind of something? Fighters? Submarines? Ghosts? Meanwhile, out on the sea, a medium bomber throws spray from its main wheels and becomes shipless. When the last B-25 leaves the deck, Hornet looks briefly naked, a creature without its armor, and more like a ship again than a parking lot. Halsey turns the task force's nose into the broad water and begins to unspool distance. The raid has become a line drawn from that deck to Tokyo and beyond, thin, taut, and made of men. Somewhere on a coast, a boy will hear an engine note he was promised he would never hear. Somewhere in a staff room, a map will suddenly feel smaller. The task force does not wait for applause. It goes low on the ocean and fast. You can second-guess the decision to launch early if you sit in a quiet room with a pencil. Out here, amid the fueled math of ships and airplanes, it is clean. The enemy heard you, therefore you go now. The Americans have turned detection, the failure of one plan, into the trigger for another. The picket boats were supposed to be a fence. Today, they were merely the starter's pistol, and in that is the point of this movement across the sea. Doctrine is slow, nerve is quick. Task Force 16 was always about the moment when quick would have to outrun slow. The men on those bridges and decks, the men in those cockpits, have made themselves into a proof of concept written on water and metal. That what you assume is impossible is sometimes only impolite to the usual way of doing things. The net was never built to stop an answer like that. It was built to catch the old world. The first Mitchell squats at the bow like a wrestler at the edge of a mat, ready to spring and very aware of gravity. Spray kicks up and strokes the underside of the forward fuselage. The ship noses into the wind as if smelling it. Lieutenant Henry Miller stands to port in a steel gale, coat snapping, goggles tight, a small figure with big authority. His arm signals are the grammar of this language. Chocks out, brakes set, power coming. The airplane answers in vibration before it does in sound, an animal waking in the dark. In the cockpit, a pilot lays hands on throttles with that combination of delicacy and insistence that separates skill from luck. Manifold, pressure rising, RPM to the number drilled 40 times a day at Florida. Cylinder heads running up but not spiking. Co-pilot, temps stable. Engineer, boost set. The pilot leans into the brakes, lets the propellers carve a channel into the wind that already races across the deck. Miller's arm lifts and cuts down. Brakes release, wheels roll. The Mitchell starts across a rectangle too short for comfort and exactly long enough for belief. Airspeed calls come like a chant you'd be embarrassed to admit is a prayer. 70, 80, 90. Flaps set to the half mark that is neither timid nor greedy. Trim on the pencil line that Florida agreed was the difference between liftoff and leap. The bow dips. The deck drops away a fraction. Everyone in the cockpit learns what the ocean looks like when you are committed, and the next word in the sentence hasn't arrived yet. The pilot resists the instinct to haul. He leans instead into the plan. Let the wing tell you. The gauge slides past the number. The yoke eases. The airplane, briefly a ground animal with wheels and shame, becomes a flying thing again. There is a second as the Mitchell clears the frightful geometry of bow, water, and left-hand rail, when every molecule in the ship relaxes. Men who do not pray nod instead, the secular gesture that says the same thing. The bomber's shadow unwraps from the deck and goes forward with it. Those who have launched Navy fighters 100 times feel, with something like professional jealousy, how much more work that heavy airplane did to find the same sky. The second Mitchell creeps into position. The routine is the same and absolutely not the same. The first airplane's success is both a gift and a trap. Confidence is now available. Complacency is too. The deck crew moves with their shoulders set against the wind, faces quartered by goggles and straps, anonymous and essential. They plant the wheels, line the nose, swap hand signals, eyeball, the space between prop and rail as if it were their own skin. Power up. The ship digs for another half knot, engines below decks roaring in harmony with the engines above, a cathedral of piston and steel. When the brakes release, the Mitchell doesn't so much accelerate as grind forward, the deep, muscular acceleration of a heavy machine that has made peace with inertia and intends to outlast it. 85. 90. The bow tips, water rears up, and for a heartbeat the airplane is a promise, not a fact. Then it is airborne, wheels licking spray and the pilot's ankles tightening involuntarily. The co-pilot keeps calling numbers because numbers are what you have when the world looks chaotic. The pilot does the small magic let it fly level in ground effect. Don't pull up like a hero, let speed build, pull gear, pull flaps in degrees. So gradual the airplane doesn't know it owes you anything. Doolittle's airplane goes next, the one most watched because leadership is a physics too. In the nose, the bombardier watches the deck streaming underneath like a long, very short road. He cannot decide whether to fix his eyes on the bow or on the airspeed needle. So he does both in a rhythm. Bow gauge, voice steady even if hand not. When the nose clears the last bit of steel and nothing is under them but Pacific, he allows himself one breath that is not part of the procedure. You can measure the takeoffs in seconds 3 dozen, maybe to go from brake set to gear coming up. But the shipboard minutes stretch. Each launch has antecedents and consequences. Each leaves the deck physically and takes a portion of tension with it, a lifting that you can almost weigh. The deck boss, leathered and loud, does a small count in his head. How many more? How long? How much wind left? How much good luck spent? If you asked him, he'd snarl something unserious, but his jaw will ache tonight from being clenched in percentage points. A hiccup. One Mitchell rides a trough uglier than the last two. The pilot sees water larger in the windscreen than any pilot raised on runways ever wants to see. The urge to pitch skyward is ancestral. Miller's hand chops down. Hold it, then rises now, and the pilot's muscle memory outruns his fear. The airplane floats for 3 longer heartbeats than anyone enjoys, then gathers itself and goes honest on the wing. Later, no one will say that airplane very nearly didn't belong to the sky. Later, the man in that left seat will stare at the deck in a dream and feel the ship drop away again forever. One by one they go, the smell of hot oil and exhaust knots in the wind. The taste of salt is thick, where spray has atomized into air. Each departing bomber throws a new signature onto the horizon, a set of black commas that become dots that become nothing. The flight deck changes personality as the bombers leave. It becomes a ship that can maneuver again, not a platform pretending to be land. Lines are coiled. Chalk marks are scuffed by booth heels. Men grin because the human body requires relief to vent somewhere. Below, on the bridge, Halsey watches with a commander's clarity and a father's pride. Launching early, far and hard was a bet that risk today would buy safety tomorrow. Each successful takeoff calculates interest on that bet. He lets himself exactly one thought that is not calculation. It is a good thing to watch Americans do a hard thing very well. When the last Mitchell lifts into a sky that is not particularly welcoming and never promised to be, the ship rings a different way. The crew knows the difference between tension and readiness. One eases into the other like gears meshing. The bombers are now lines on a map, a ragged wedge angling toward a coast no one aboard will see today. The sea eats the noise. The carriers turn their faces away and make themselves small. The moment of truth is over. The longer truth inland, in cities and staff rooms, begins to unspool. Cloud breaks over fields and suburbs. The ocean, a hard blue sheet, gives way to a softer geometry. Canals, tiled roofs, patches of factory grey. The Mitchells come in at a height that makes everything look hand-drawn. The pilots recognize features from briefings. A radio mast here, a river bend like a crooked finger there. The navigators, bent over maps, call adjustments and confirm what the windows already say. This is the right place. On paper, the air defense web has teeth. Radar sites knit seams where coast meets sky. Observer posts are drilled. Fighter units are stationed to leap. On paper, the Mitchells should slot into the threat matrix like blocks that trigger an automatic response. Scramble, vector, intercept, destroy. In practice, the raid arrives from an angle the matrix struggles to understand. Twin-engine silhouettes at low altitude are filed under unlikely. The human brain, asked to classify, rifles past the right card twice before intuition taps it on the shoulder. That delay is a gift you cannot plan for and cannot buy, only earn by audacity. The first bombs are not the weight of history. They are iron and explosive and intention, walking down roofs and courtyards. Their sound is distinct from any peacetime concussion. Windows blow in, then blow out, then disappear. Factory whistles whoop without orders to. On a riverfront, a bargeman looks up and sees an airplane at a height you normally reserve for dreams. He makes the sign of a cross he learned from a Portuguese sailor and has never used. The god he's invoking is not listening to air defense nets. A fighter unit gets the call. The watch officer, conscious of embarrassment as much as duty, sends men to cockpits with a speed that looks like violence. Ground crews rush in disciplined panic. Chocks yanked, primers pumped, props swung. Engines turn with a cough and a roar that speaks in a dialect of oil. Pilots pull straps until their chests pinch and the edges of their vision tighten. Wheels lift. The sky is a book in which they are sure they know how this story goes. It will not go that way today. The vectors are late and vague. Reports from observers contradict one another. Single engine, float plane. 2 engines, American, impossible. The controller draws lines on glass and feels foolish doing it. Fighters push to altitude that isn't relevant because training says high cover is the honest way to meet a threat. The bombers are below that, threading between rooflines and smokestacks, atrium-level flyers using the ground as a shield, the old trick of turning geography into armor. One pair of fighters overflies a Mitchell by 300 meters without seeing it because the target is hidden in the visual clutter of its own shadow. Anti-aircraft guns speak up late and sullen, like men interrupted at supper. A few crews lead accurately. Most throw iron at where they think airplanes ought to be rather than where they are. The Mitchells are in and out too fast for elaborate solutions. A handful of burst patterns get close enough that crews feel shock slap through the fuselage, one of those hollow thumps that make you aware of how little separates you from outside. A bombardier in one ship mutters a curse in a language his pilot doesn't speak. The pilot answers in the only language he knows. More throttle, cleaner line, don't jink at the wrong second and bleed the speed you paid for on the deck of a ship a lifetime ago. Civilian reactions belong to the same family as military ones. Disbelief, through which duty or fear or curiosity pierce. Some point, some run, some freeze. Workers in a foundry yard stand because they are not allowed to believe a thing until a superior tells them to. A school class is shepherded under desks, as if wooden slats could turn steel. A few brave or foolish souls climb rooftops to watch the foreign machines cut the sky and light the horizon with angry punctuation marks. As the bombers complete their runs and angle for the egress vector, the interception picture improves, in theory, not in reality. Fighters finally arrive in the right chunk of air, but the geometry is wrong. The Mitchells are no longer inbound to predictable targets. They are outbound into a blur of ground, features that mess with closure rates and firing solutions. A few passes are made. A few guns chuff smoke. Tracers reach. Pilots in both kinds of airplanes do the things muscle memory orders them to. Kill claims will be filed. Some will be true. Many will be pried with paperwork. What matters more than kills is time. Every minute a fighter spends climbing or searching is a minute a bomber spends leaving. The Mitchells roll out of the city at a height that keeps them under the net, that gets better the higher you go. The idea that heavy twin-engine bombers could behave like rude guests at a low-party barge in, make noise, leave without asking does not compute. But here they are. The radar reports that tried to explain them now echo without consequence. The city sounds different for a while. Sirens, a roll of collapsing masonry, the crackle that follows a small fire becoming a bigger one. Pilots make mental Polaroids they'll carry. The angle of a bridge as the nose cut across it, the brief shape of a rooftop crowd, the way a smokestack looked up close, textured, like a thing you could touch. Back in the cabin, navigators return their focus to the long leg west, to the fuel figures that are less friendly than they were at dawn. Radios reach for beacons that are shy or silent. The mission is still theatre, and the applause will be delayed and complicated. The audience includes people who will pay for this performance with more than fear. Behind them, officers in staff rooms draw conclusions, some sharp, some sentimental, some wrong. The first and strongest, assumptions need new labels. The second, the ocean is not a moat. The third leaks in like a draft under a door. If foreign aircraft can pass over the capital, then war is not something that only happens at sea and on distant islands. It is a visitor. The interception that would have solved this problem with gunfire failed not because Japan lacked brave pilots or decent airplanes. It failed because the raid denied the system what it needed most: time to think. In war, as in life, the first liar wins if he lies with movement, and you answer with deliberation. Today, the lie was that medium bombers cannot launch from a ship. The answer arrived late. The bombers, audacious, heavy, improbable, are already reading the coastline for exits. When the engines wind down in memory, the part no one wants to dramatize remains. Where the crews went and what happened to those who did not make it to friendly ground. The plan required landing in China, and elsewhere drawn in pencil, a geography of airfields more hoped for than guaranteed. Weather, fuel, darkness, and navigation errors turned land into try and try into ditch or bail out. Parachutes blossomed in night air. Some crews hit ground they could not see except as blackness rushing up. Some put their machines into fields or surf and clawed their way out. Some did not. In the days that followed, several raiders were captured. They had names, parents, ranks, jokes they told in Florida that made other men roll eyes, photographs of sweethearts that creased at the folds. Their captures turned into interrogations. Interrogations turned into trials that were not really trials. Executions were carried out. One died later in captivity. Others endured years that took shape around hunger and sickness, ending only as the larger war unwound. The story, which began as a demonstration of reach and nerve, now had the taste of iron in it. Heroism does not cancel suffering. It stands next to it, grave and inadequate. China bore a cost even larger and more diffuse. Villages that had given help, or were suspected of giving help, were punished. Operations swept through provinces with a thorough bureaucratic cruelty reprisals that scorched fields and took lives in a number so hard to write cleanly that writers avoid it to spare themselves, not the dead. The logic of those campaigns was the logic of a regime that believed fear could retroactively alter the past. If you hurt enough people now, no one will have helped yesterday. The raid, designed to puncture the myth of invulnerability, pierced civilians who were nowhere near a decision-making room. Ethics in war often arrive as an echo. The first sound is an engine note, daring and new. The second is a quieter reckoning with consequences you foresaw dimly, or not at all. Did the raid save future lives by accelerating choices in Tokyo that brought decisive battles forward? Did it cost lives on the ground in China that no calculus can justify? These are not mutually exclusive statements. The mature answer is that history refuses to accept that the weight of one category balances the other neatly. You can respect the courage of crews who launched into a mission with paper-thin margins and, in the same breath, mourn people who never knew those crews existed until soldiers came to their door. For the men who flew, the human cost was also personal. Guilt for what their presence triggered, grief for crewmen gone missing, a lifetime of thinking about a night jump, and the sickening, helpless wait until the ground told them what happened next. In reunions years later, when the noise had been replaced by speeches and the bright politeness of ceremonies, you can see in photographs how they held these truths. Some aged into serenity, some kept a private weather front behind the eyes. On the other side, Japanese civilians learned in an instant that war had an upstairs and a downstairs. Downstairs streets, kitchens, factories was now reachable. The anger that news editors stoked and the sorrow that families felt flowed into a single current, a demand for more protection and a demand for more punishment. Militaries drink deeply from such currents. You can chart subsequent operations to their source in part here, in the sudden proximity of enemy shadow to home. The human mind likes to make simple trades. If we strike hard there, they will not come here again. The trades are almost always lies. You will hear sometimes that acts of war sort cleanly into necessary and evil. You will hear, too, that the moral accounting belongs to people who never had to tie a parachute in the dark or kneel with tied hands. Both statements are inadequate. The way to honor the raid is not to varnish its edges, but to look at them, to say, this was courage, and this caused pain. This was a symbol, and this had bodies in it. This advanced the war to a decisive place, and this left scars still visible in family stories in towns you cannot find on a casual map. There is another human cost that doesn't draw headlines. The quiet shift in the hearts of ordinary Japanese people who now had to carry an extra weight of fear to work. Children who tracked aircraft with new attention. Housewives who watched the laundry for sudden wind not because of weather but because of sirens. Fear changes how communities talk to each other. It teaches a new politeness that is really vigilance. The raid, in that sense, rewired routines. The damage to property could be repaired. The damage to a sense of safety required a different kind of craft. None of this undoes the tactical brilliance. It enriches our understanding of what tactical brilliance buys and the kinds of currency it spends. If you want to tell the story in the voice you've chosen, tight, numbers-driven, vivid, you also owe it this room, this chapter where ordinal facts make space for the weight of being human in a war that made machines sing. Numbers still matter here. They are just not the only things that do. Strategy travels at two speeds. The speed of meetings and the speed of fear. The raid forced both to run faster. In Tokyo, the fact that hostile aircraft had flown unimpeded over the capital was not merely an insult. It was intelligence. It said the enemy had the imagination to use carriers as bridges for machines they were not built for. It said the ocean was porous in ways pre-war white papers had not admitted. It demanded answers. One answer was doctrinal. Harden the perimeter. Push the early warning line farther out, crush the bases in China that might shelter such raids again, shuffle air defense resources in a way that favored the homeland, even if it starved campaigns elsewhere. Another answer was operational and grand. Seize places that would remove the American hand from the chessboard by pulling the board itself away. The Central Pacific, small islands, big consequences rose on planning maps as the place where you could force the US Navy to fight at a disadvantage. If you read post-raid documents sideways, you can see the shape of a decisive battle coalescing around a tiny atoll whose name would become shorthand for a turning. The raid's material damage was limited. Its strategic effect was to relocate Japanese confidence from the invulnerable column to the anxious one. Anxiety has consequences. It drives risk-taking dressed as preemption. It encourages operations to be scheduled, not because logistics are ripe, but because emotions are. It bends smart men toward proving a point rather than solving a problem. When an empire decides it must demonstrate reach and control to itself as much as to the enemy, it chooses battlefields that flatter its self-image. The sea does not care about self-image. On the American side, the aftershock was inversely proportional. Confidence rose, caution sharpened rather than dulled. For a nation that had absorbed disaster and bad news, here was proof that audacity could be engineered, that inter-service cooperation could be more than a memo, that crews could be taught to threads, needles with angry wind and come out the other side. Morale is not an abstraction. It loosens tight jaws. It changes the slope of a production curve because the men and women at lathes feel they are machining for momentum, not merely replacement. It makes admirals more willing to believe in daring with purpose. Strategically, the raid did something precious and rare. It adjusted the opponent's calendar. Operations that might have waited were hastened. Forces that might have been husbanded were committed. Enterprise went one way because pride required it. When decisive fleets met, they did so earlier than they would have otherwise, with strengths and weaknesses distributed differently because of decisions made in rooms where the memory of sirens over Tokyo still rang faintly in the carpet. You can tell a simplified story in which the raid draws a straight line to a battle where carriers will trade the lives of their air groups for the lives of the other guy's carriers. The real line is more tangled, braided with other strands. Code-breaking work that turned secrets into plans, industrial base that turned plans into hulls and machines, personality traits in leaders that turned caution into gambles. The raid's contribution to that rope was a hardening of American will and a softening of Japanese certainty. In warfare, that exchange rate is favorable. There is also the geography of mind to consider. Japanese officers who had never been in love with the Central Pacific had to fall in with colleagues who were. Those who argued for consolidating gains and grinding attrition were nudged aside by the emotional caffeine of a capital struck. It is not that the raid caused a specific set-piece battle. It altered the menu of things that felt necessary to those with pens. Eden became urgent. Defensive belts thickened in places that did not need them, and thinned in places that suddenly did. The empire began to protect its image of itself as much as its actual coastline. And look again at the audience in America that the raiders never met. In small towns and cities, newspapers ran photographs that were as much compositions as they were documentation. People clipped them and tucked them into Bibles and scrapbooks. This too is strategy, the flow of volunteerism, war bond purchases, production speeds. When a factory shifts from night to day, shift with fewer late punches because men and women feel they are in a winning story, that uptick doesn't show on a map. It does show up in readiness, in training hours completed, in parts that make it onto carriers that will sail to engagements that are hard enough without wondering if the machining was sloppy. The Japanese response, meanwhile, wasted a quiet resource. Patience. Good strategy often looks like boredom, waiting until the chessboard is set to your advantage, and then moving. Bad strategy often looks like passion, striking because you were struck. The Doolittle raid, by insulting certainty in a way theatre always intends to, made the second mood attractive. Ambition reached past prudence. The Japanese Navy, whose carrier arm had been a breed apart for years, now had to satisfy land-based generals who wanted to see proof that the home islands were wrapped in iron. When your own bureaucracy becomes an audience for your own performance, you start aiming operations at applause. In this series, the last lesson is the same as the first. Impossibility is often misfiled inconvenience. The B-25 seconds were not magic. They were machinery married to planning, discipline, and risk appetite. Their launch from a carrier deck did not change the physics of the Pacific. It changed the psychology of two empires. One learned that the ocean was a two-way door. The other remembered, suddenly and decisively, that audacity is a force multiplier, so close with the image that opened this arc. A city under a noon sky, twin-engine thunder, where doctrine said silence, faces upturned, a nation catching to its breath. Then cut to the deck at dawn where men braced knees, watched a flag, and pushed throttle to the stop because the next chapter of the war wanted to be written by people who felt like writing it. The Japanese never expected medium bombers could take off from carriers. After April, they expected something worse, that the enemy could surprise them again. That fear, not the bombs, is what did the most work.